She vanished before sunrise, leaving behind only silence and suspicion. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ervela. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're watching from today. Your words bring each mystery to life. Let's begin. The sun hung lazily over the thatched rooftops of St. Mildred's, a village so quiet that even the bees seemed to hum in genteel rhythm. The morning was alive with anticipation. The curate's wedding was to take place that very afternoon, and half the village had come out early to help with the finishing touches. At the vicarage garden, white bunting fluttered, and tables were laid with lace cloths and teapots gleaming like sentinels of propriety. The bride-to-be, Miss Emily Worsley, was the picture of quiet delight, demure, rosy-cheeked, and every inch the well-brought-up daughter of the late schoolmaster. Her intended, Mr. Lionel Graves, the new curate, was a tall, serious man whose sermons were said to stir the conscience, though not the soul, according to Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed judge of morality. Among the guests, unnoticed but ever watchful, sat Miss Jane Marple, knitting something white and delicate, perhaps for a baby, though she never said whose. She had been invited by Reverend Harper, who believed that no gathering was complete without dear Miss Marple. She seized to the tone of a room. As the villagers admired the decorations, chatter flowed like tea. "They say she's marrying beneath her," whispered Mrs. Larkin, nodding toward the curate. "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Bantry. "He's a man of God, though rather poor, of course. But Emily's always had peculiar taste. Remember that dreadful artist she nearly ran off with?" At that Miss Marple looked up briefly. "Ah, yes," she said softly. "Mr. Sandon, wasn't it? Such a pity his watercolours were always more vivid than truthful." Before anyone could pursue the remark, Reverend Harper emerged from the house, face pale as parchment. "Ladies, gentlemen, please, your attention," he called out, voice trembling. The wedding will be delayed. Miss Worsley is missing." A hush fell so deep that even the birds seemed to pause. "Missing?" gasped Mrs. Price Ridley. "But how can a bride be missing on her wedding day?" The Reverend wrung his hands. Her bed was unslept in, her dress untouched. The maid last saw her at 10:30 last night, praying in the chapel. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. "Praying," she murmured, "at that hour? Dear me." And though no one noticed, her eyes, clear, pale, and infinitely perceptive, rested briefly on the curate, who stood apart from the crowd, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or panic. Would you like me to continue with Section 2? The Village React, where gossip ripples through St. Mildred's and the first suspicions form. Morning in St. Mildred's broke with a strange stillness, as though the air itself held its breath. The news of the missing bride had travelled faster than the sound of church bells. By 8 o'clock, every cottage window was open, and voices spilled out in anxious, scandalized tones. In a village where the theft of a geranium pot could fuel a week of gossip, the disappearance of the curate's bride was an event of biblical proportion. Miss Marple walked briskly to the village green, where small groups had already formed in expectant knots. The butcher's wife stood beside the postmistress, both pretending to exchange practical opinions, but clearly hungry for speculation. Near the tea shop, young Timothy Brent, who delivered the morning papers, was telling anyone who would listen that he'd seen a shadow near the churchyard at midnight. Tall, slim, moving quickly. He wasn't sure, of course, but he'd swear it was wearing something white. "White, you say?" murmured Miss Marple as she paused beside him, her knitting bag hanging lightly from one arm. Perhaps the moonlight caught the tombstones. It can do that, you know. Make one thing seem quite another. Her tone was gentle, but her eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. The boy flushed. Could be, miss, but I'm sure it was moving. Most things do, dear, she said mildly. Even imagination, when encouraged. She gave him a small smile, and continued toward the church, leaving the boy with an uncomfortable sense that his certainty had melted away. At the vicarage gate, Constable Pritchard was taking statements from the housemaid, Alice. The girl's eyes were red from crying, her apron twisted nervously in her hands. I saw her go into the chapel, miss, just before 10:30. She looked pale, like she'd been crying herself. But I thought brides often get like that. I went to bed after locking the back door. When I came down this morning, her room was empty. Bed not touched, shoes still by the hearth. It's dreadful, ain't it? Miss Marple listened quietly, hands folded while the constable scribbled dutifully. Did you notice if she had her shawl, Alice? She asked. Alice shook her head. No, miss. It was hanging on the peg. Then she wasn't planning to be out long, Miss Marple said softly. A woman always thinks of her shoulders at night. They're more sensitive than men imagine. She turned slightly to the constable. You'll want to look near the chapel path, I expect. Already done, Miss Marple, he said somewhat defensively. No sign of her. Reverend Harper's asked we keep quiet till Mr. Graves gives word. Quite right, said Miss Marple. Silence preserves dignity, though, alas, seldom for long in a village. Indeed, by midday, silence had long surrendered. Mrs. Price Ridley was declaring in the grocer's that she'd always suspected something peculiar about Miss Worsley's engagement. So sudden, after all. She was nearly 30, and one doesn't wait that long for love unless one's waiting for something else. Entirely. To which Mrs. Bantry replied that she found the curate a trifle severe for a bridegroom, while Mrs. Larkin leaned forward with relish. They say he scolded her about her friendship with that artist fellow. What was his name again? Before they were even engaged. Jealous men make cruel husbands. Miss Marple, who had paused to buy currant bread, listened as though mildly entertained by the conversation, yet missed nothing of its content. Jealousy, she murmured, weighing her change, is such an inconvenient emotion for the devout. It always finds ways to disguise itself. Piety, concern, duty. Such clever costumes for such an old vice. Do you think he's done something dreadful, Miss Marple? Whispered Mrs. Bantry, delighted by the possibility. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, I think people are dreadful often enough, though rarely for the reasons we expect. She left them whispering behind her, and made her way toward the chapel. It stood apart from the main church, a small stone building with ivy creeping up its walls. The door was unlocked. No one ever thought to lock it, and the faint scent of candle wax still lingered from the previous night's vigil. The light fell through coloured glass, painting the pews in fractured reds and blues. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes taking in the details that others overlooked. A small smudge of wax near the altar rail, a handkerchief half crumpled on the second pew, a faint drag mark near the side door that opened to the churchyard. She stooped and picked up the handkerchief. The embroidery in one corner read E.W. Emily Worsley. The fabric was damp, but not from tears. She touched it delicately to her lips. Rainwater, she said softly. And yet it did not rain last night. She straightened just as the heavy door creaked behind her. Mr. Graves entered, his face pale, eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. Miss Marple, he said hoarsely, I beg you, this is not a time for idle curiosity. Indeed not, she agreed. But you must forgive an old woman for wondering. The human heart is a curious garden, and sometimes weeds grow where one least expects them." He looked at her sharply. "You speak in riddles." "Only to those who fear plain words," she replied gently. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, was Miss Worsley unhappy?" He flinched. "Unhappy? No. Troubled, perhaps, by trifles. Nerves before the wedding." "Ah, nerves," she said. "They do make one restless. I recall a bride who vanished once, years ago, because she realized she loved her freedom more than her vows. Of course, she was found the next day at a railway station with a hat box and no destination." He turned away. "Emily would never do something so cowardly." "No," said Miss Marple, her tone thoughtful. "She does not strike me as cowardly, nor impulsive. Still, women have disappeared for stranger reasons. Some to escape, others to protect someone they love." He gave a strained laugh. "Protect? From what, pray?" "Ah, that is the question." Outside, the bell from St. Mildred's struck 1 o'clock, echoing over the rooftops. The sound seemed to shake something loose in Mr. Graves. He ran a hand over his face. "I found this," he said finally, drawing a folded paper from his pocket. "On her desk this morning." Miss Marple accepted it carefully. The note was brief, written in a hurried hand. "Forgive me, I cannot go through with it. Tell them it is for the best. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably feminine." "Have you shown this to the Reverend?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet. I wish to understand it first. It doesn't make sense. Emily was devoted. We planned everything together." Miss Marple looked at the paper again, turning it toward the light. "A curious thing about such letters," she mused. "They rarely say what they mean. One must read them twice, once with the eyes, once with the heart. I wonder which organ of yours she was writing to." Mr. Graves drew himself up, his mouth tightening. "I do not appreciate your insinuations, Miss Marple. My fiancé is missing, not dead, and I would thank you not to treat this as a puzzle for your amusement." She inclined her head slightly. "I assure you, Mr. Graves, I never find human misery amusing, only instructive." He left abruptly, boots echoing on the chapel floor. Miss Marple remained where she was for a long moment, staring after him, her expression unreadable. Then she refolded the note, placed it delicately in her reticule, and stepped outside into the blinding afternoon light. The village green was a scene of uneasy bustle. Search parties forming, men calling instructions, women whispering. Overhead clouds gathered in the west, bruised and heavy. A storm was coming. At the edge of the green stood young Dr. Leonard Pierce, the new physician, his bicycle propped beside him. He looked relieved to see Miss Marple approach. "They're turning the whole place upside down," he said quietly. "No trace of her yet. Poor Lionel's beside himself." "Poor everyone," Miss Marple corrected gently. "When something disturbs a still pond, every reflection wavers." He smiled faintly. "You think she's still alive, then?" "I think," she said, "that the truth is seldom as tidy as we hope. But I do believe, Doctor, that people rarely vanish without leaving something of themselves behind. A word, a glance, a footprint. Sometimes it's merely in another's conscience." He looked puzzled, but she did not explain. Instead, she gazed toward the darkening sky where thunder muttered far off. "We shall know more after the storm," she said softly. "Weather clears more than air, you know. It clears people's tempers and their lives." As she turned to leave, a gust of wind swept through the square, scattering leaves across the path. Among them fluttered a torn scrap of lace, white, fine, unmistakably bridal. Miss Marple stooped, caught it in her hand, and held it a moment before slipping it into her pocket. The villagers would talk themselves breathless before dusk, but she already sensed that beneath their chatter something much darker moved, something that had begun long before the curate's bride went missing before dawn. The storm broke before sunset. Heavy rain lashed the village of St. Mildred's, turning its neat lanes into rivulets of brown water, and driving even the most devoted gossipers indoors. In the vicarage, lamps flickered against the gloom, and the air was thick with damp and unease. Reverend Harper sat by the hearth, wringing his hands while Mr. Graves paced like a caged animal, his boots muddy and his collar undone. The note from Emily lay upon the mantelpiece, curling slightly at the edges. Constable Pritchard, soaked through, stood awkwardly near the door. "We've searched the woods past Miller's Hill, sir. Nothing but a scrap of ribbon. Might be hers, might not. No footprints. Rain's washed everything clean." Mr. Graves gave a short, bitter laugh. "Clean," he said. "You call this clean? The whole village is wallowing in dirt and whispers." "Now, Lionel," Reverend Harper murmured, "we mustn't give way to despair. Perhaps she simply needed time." "Time?" Graves turned on him sharply. "You speak as though she's taken a holiday. She wouldn't run from me, not Emily." Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly near the window, her knitting in her lap, looked up. "You seem very sure of that, Mr. Graves." "I am," he said fiercely. "She loved me." "Love is a strange creature," Miss Marple replied softly. "It often means very different things to two people who use the same word. To one, it is devotion. To another, possession." The room fell silent, save for the hiss of rain on the glass. Even Reverend Harper's lips stopped moving in habitual prayer. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but the men are heading to the river once the rain stops. Might have been she slipped near the bridge. Dark night, narrow path." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, it's quite possible. Though, if she did fall, I wonder why she would have been walking that way at all. The chapel lies east, not west." The constable looked uncertain. Perhaps she lost her way. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested otherwise. And yet she was not a flighty girl. Miss Worsley had a keen sense of direction. She once guided me through the church archives, as though she'd memorized every shelf. "No, I think she went where she meant to go." Mr. Graves gave an impatient sigh. "You speak as though you knew her better than I did." "Oh, hardly," said Miss Marple mildly. "Only as well as one can from conversation. But conversation, when one listens closely, tells rather a lot." He turned away, muttering something about interference. Reverend Harper rose quickly to smooth the tension. "Perhaps we should all rest. Tomorrow will bring clarity. Miss Marple stood folding her knitting with neat precision. "Yes," she said, "tomorrow does tend to bring things to light, mud, bones, or truth, depending on the soil." When she left the vicarage, the storm had lessened to a drizzle. She walked with measured steps through the glistening lanes, her umbrella tilting slightly in the wind. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac. Passing the chapel, she paused. The door was shut now, locked at last, but something made her linger. Through the rain-streaked window, she could just see the faint outline of the altar cloth, white, with a dark patch near the edge. Candle soot, she thought at first, but the pattern was irregular, as though something had been pressed against it. She made a mental note. Such details were like loose threads, small, but they often unravelled the whole garment. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the village washed and trembling. The search resumed with fresh vigour, though the men's voices carried less hope than before. The river was swollen, its current fierce. They found a woman's glove snagged on a branch, and the constable brought it to Miss Marple, who examined it without comment. The initials E.W. were stitched delicately inside. "Her glove," Pritchard said grimly. You think she fell? Miss Marple looked toward the water. I think, she said slowly, that whoever placed this here wanted you to think so. You see, the thread is unfrayed, the silk unstained. It was not torn from her hand. It was set there. The constable frowned. You mean someone planted it? She smiled faintly. Such ugly words, my dear. Let us say, arranged. That afternoon, she took tea with Mrs. Bantry, whose delight in tragedy was only matched by her skill at piecing together rumours. The sitting-room was warm, fragrant with rosewater. They say, Mrs. Bantry confided, that the curate and Miss Worsley quarrelled the day before the wedding. Something about a letter, perhaps from that artist fellow she used to see. I've always thought such bohemian men dangerous. Paint and passion go hand in hand, you know. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Did anyone see this letter? Oh, no, but Mrs. Price Ridley heard it from the vicar's cook, who said she found torn paper in the bin. Looked like handwriting. Torn paper often looks like handwriting to those inclined to imagination, said Miss Marple mildly. Still, such tales seldom rise without some smoke below. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Do you think he might have killed her, Miss Marple? In a fit of jealousy? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Jealousy rarely kills swiftly, my dear. It corrodes, it seeps. If it has killed, it was planned long before the fit began. When she left, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting the village in deceptive calm. Children were playing again on the green, their laughter carrying thinly through the air. Yet behind curtained windows whispers persisted, each household spinning its own theory. Some said Emily had run off to London, others swore she had drowned herself in despair. Only Miss Marple seemed unswayed by conjecture. She stopped at the post office to collect her weekly letter from her nephew Raymond, and, in the process, caught the postmistress frowning over her ledger. Something amiss, Miss Harker? The woman looked up. Just odd, Miss Marple. Miss Worsley sent a parcel 2 days ago, addressed to a Miss Beryl Sandon in Chelsea. No return address, but I remember the handwriting. Seemed nervous, shaky. I nearly asked her if she was unwell. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her mind leapt. And this Beryl Sandon, relation to the artist, perhaps? His sister, I believe. She stayed with him a while back, before he left for London. How very thoughtful of Miss Worsley, said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. A bride-to-be sending a parcel to her rival sister. How peculiar. That evening she wrote a brief note to Inspector Craddock at county headquarters, an old acquaintance who treated her conclusions with the respect of a man often proven wrong. She asked for a discreet inquiry into one Mr. Frederick Sandon, artist lately residing in Chelsea, and whether he had recently returned to St. Mildred's. When the constable brought word later that a tramp had been seen near the railway cutting the previous night, Miss Marple listened without surprise. Tall, thin, with a satchel and paint-stained cuffs, the man said. Could be nothing, could be him. Oh, it's something, she said quietly. Everything is something if one looks properly. That night the village slept uneasily. The curate's window stayed lit long past midnight. Reverend Harper prayed aloud in his study. The rain returned, whispering against the panes like secrets. And at the edge of the graveyard, where the old yew trees stooped low, a small, pale shape glimmered briefly before vanishing into darkness. Miss Marple saw it from her bedroom window, the movement no more than a ripple between the stones. She did not cry out or fetch help. Instead, she reached for her shawl and settled back in her chair, eyes thoughtful, lips pursed. Ah, she murmured, so the dead are not yet done with us. By dawn, she was up again, walking toward the chapel with a briskness that belied her age. The mist was thick, curling through the gravestones like smoke. Near the side door she paused, and there, half buried in the damp earth, she saw a small silver locket. Inside was a miniature photograph of Emily Worsley, and opposite the face of a man who was not Lionel Graves. She closed the locket gently and slipped it into her reticule. Somewhere in the village a cock crowed, breaking the hush. The sun rose weakly through the fog, gilding the rooftops. Miss Marple turned toward the vicarage, her step measured, her expression serene, though her thoughts were already moving far ahead. The curate's bride was missing, yes, but now Miss Marple knew. She had not gone willingly, nor entirely alone. The morning mist still lingered over St. Mildred's when Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage once again. The locket in her reticule felt heavier than silver ought to, as though it carried not just a photograph, but a burden of truth waiting to be uncovered. The path was still slick from the rain, and the grass along the churchyard glistened with dew. Sparrows pecked busily near the graves, indifferent to the dramas of the living. Reverend Harper greeted her at the door with his usual gentleness, though his eyes were shadowed from sleeplessness. "Ah, Miss Marple," he sighed, "I fear the news remains grim. No sign of her, and the river's still too wild to drag, I dare say," Miss Marple murmured, stepping inside. "But I wonder if it's the river we should be looking at all." The Reverend blinked, clearly puzzled. "Not the river. Water washes things away," she said softly, removing her gloves. "But I've always found that secrets, unlike mud, cling stubbornly to dry places. May I speak with Mr. Graves?" He hesitated, glancing toward the sitting-room. He's not himself, but perhaps it would comfort him to talk." Miss Marple inclined her head and entered. The curate stood by the fireplace again, still in his damp cassock, eyes hollow, a man worn down by something more corrosive than grief. He did not turn as she approached. "Mr. Graves," she said quietly, "I thought you might wish to see this." She placed the locket on the mantel, where the dying firelight caught the small, delicate hinge. He looked down, and his breath hitched. "Where did you—" "In the churchyard, near the side path," she answered. "I imagine Miss Worsley dropped it in haste, though one can never be certain. It's a curious thing, don't you think, to wear another man's likeness beside your own?" His face paled. He faltered. "That man is Frederick Sandon. She knew him once before she met me." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She spoke of him once at tea, you know. Said he painted her portrait, but never finished it. I thought it rather poetic until I saw this." She tapped the locket gently. "Portraits have a way of revealing more than faces, Mr. Graves. Sometimes they reveal the truth about hearts." He turned away sharply. "You don't understand. Whatever there was between them ended years ago." "Ah, but did it?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, almost kind. "Love, even when ended, has the awkward habit of leaving traces. Letters, perhaps, or gifts. Sometimes even a parcel sent by post." His head jerked toward her, and for the first time real alarm flashed in his eyes. "A parcel?" "Yes," she said simply. "To Chelsea, to a Miss Beryl Sandon. 2 days before the wedding." He swallowed hard, his composure fraying. "You've been prying." "I've been observing," she corrected. "There is a difference. People are very revealing when they think no one is watching. And I've found in my experience that the heart often betrays the hand before it betrays itself." He moved suddenly toward her, voice trembling. "If you're suggesting she meant to leave me—" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Oh, I'm not suggesting anything. I only notice that her actions do not quite match the portrait of a happy bride. And then there's the curious matter of that note. Forgive me, I cannot go through with it. Rather odd phrasing, don't you think?" Not I cannot marry you, but as though the ceremony itself were the thing she feared, not the man. His lips parted, but no sound came. The clock ticked between them, slow and inexorable. "Did you know," she went on, "that the handwriting on that note, though hers, bore signs of being written under stress? The letters are uneven, the strokes uncertain, as though written not in privacy, but under watchful eyes." He stared at her, something flickering. Fear, anger, guilt, it was difficult to say. "You think someone forced her?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that she was afraid of something or someone. And fear, Mr. Graves, is the most practical of emotions. It always leads somewhere. For a moment he seemed about to protest, then only muttered, "You're wrong," and left the room abruptly, the door slamming behind him. Miss Marple stood very still, gazing at the fire. Then she turned to Reverend Harper, who had been hovering anxiously in the doorway. "Poor young man," she said softly. "It is dreadful to love someone one does not quite understand. So often it ends in tragedy or in silence." The Reverend frowned. "You don't suspect? Surely you don't believe Lionel had anything to do with—" "My dear Reverend," Miss Marple interrupted kindly, "I never believe. I only notice. And just now I noticed that he did not ask what was inside the locket, only how I found it. That afternoon Miss Marple went calling, an activity that in St. Mildred's could mean anything from gentle gossip to the extraction of confessions. Her first visit was to Alice, the housemaid, who was scrubbing the chapel floor. The girl looked up in surprise as Miss Marple approached. "My, you're early, miss. I was just getting the wax off from the candles." "So diligent," said Miss Marple approvingly. "It must have been quite the mess last night, with all the comings and goings." Alice nodded. "Oh, yes, miss. The Reverend and the Curate both in and out. And poor Miss Worsley. I keep thinking how she knelt right there the night before she went missing." Miss Marple glanced at the floor, noting a faint dark patch near the altar rail. "You've done a fine job, but tell me, Alice, did you clean this bit here yesterday?" Alice frowned. "No, miss, that part was already damp when I came in. I thought the roof might have leaked." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Yes, perhaps, though rain rarely leaves such a rusty hue, wouldn't you say?" The girl followed her gaze, and her face blanched. "Oh, Lord, do you think—" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that you ought to fetch Constable Pritchard." Within the hour, the constable had arrived along with a few of the village men. They examined the floor, pried up one loose tile, and beneath it found a small square of linen stained a deep brown. The air grew heavy with a silence that spoke louder than any cry. "Blood," Pritchard said grimly. "Has to be," Miss Marple nodded, though her expression was distant. "Yes, but whose? That, you see, is what matters." They followed the faint trail to the chapel's side door, where the latch showed fresh scratches. Outside the ground was churned, though the rain had washed away any footprints. Beyond the path, near the yew trees, something white gleamed faintly. A fragment of torn muslin snagged on a branch. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully. "A piece of a bridal gown," she said softly. "So she was here." The constable rubbed his chin. "But then where'd she go after?" "That," Miss Marple said, "depends on whether she left at all." By evening the village hummed with fresh speculation. Theories multiplied like ivy, each clinging to the last. Some said she'd been taken by gypsies, others that she'd fled with her artist lover. But Miss Marple, seated once again in her neat cottage, did not join the chatter. She sat by the window, reading her Bible by lamplight, though her mind was far from Scripture. The locket lay open beside her, the two faces staring silently from their tiny frames. When the knock came, Soft, hurried, she rose at once. It was Dr. Pierce, looking pale and anxious. "Miss Marple, I came because, well, I thought you ought to know. The constable asked me to look at that blood stain. It's human, all right, but old. A day at least before the disappearance. And there's something else, yes? The blood type doesn't match Miss Worsley's records. It's the wrong group entirely." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "Ah, then we have not one mystery, but two." He looked confused. "You mean someone else was hurt? Or killed," she said softly. "But not Miss Worsley. Which means, my dear doctor, she may still be very much alive, and hiding from whoever shed that blood." Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance, low and lingering. Miss Marple closed the locket, her fingers steady. "You see, doctor," she said, "evil is like mildew. It grows best in the dark. And something tells me we've only begun to lift the curtain." The lamplight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Somewhere beyond the village a dog howled, a mournful, lonely sound, and in the stillness that followed, Miss Marple's expression hardened, her thoughts sharpening like a needle poised above thread. The game, she knew, had only just begun. The following morning dawned cold and damp, a fine mist hanging low over St. Mildred's, softening the outlines of roofs and hedgerows. The church bell tolled for early prayers, though few came. Those who did moved in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the chapel as though afraid the building itself might whisper secrets. Miss Marple, having slept little, rose before dawn. Her kettle whistled sharply in the stillness as she poured herself a modest cup of tea, her thoughts moving in quiet, precise order, as nimble as the fingers that folded her napkin. She reviewed what she knew: a missing bride, a planted glove, a note that rang false, a locket with two faces, and now a stain of blood belonging to no one expected. Each fact sat in her mind like a bead on a string, separate yet somehow connected. All she lacked was the thread to tie them. By 8 o'clock she was walking briskly toward the green. The puddles had frozen in thin patches of glassy ice, crunching under her sensible shoes. Near the post office she met Constable Pritchard, red-eyed and weary from the long night. "Morning, Miss Marple. The inspector's come down from county. Name of Armitage. Proper man, sharp as a tack, though he's not keen on old ladies meddling." "Ah," she said pleasantly. "Then I shall be sure not to meddle, only to observe, which, in my experience, is far more dangerous." He laughed uncertainly and tipped his cap. "They're searching the rectory gardens now. Inspector thinks she may have been buried nearby." "People who bury things," Miss Marple murmured, "rarely choose the places others expect. But it will keep them busy, which is useful in itself." When she reached the vicarage, she found Inspector Armitage standing by the gate, stocky, brisk, moustache trimmed to a precise line. He eyed her as one might an unexpected draught through a closed window. "Miss Marple, is it? I've heard of you," he said, not altogether warmly. "Unofficially, of course. I'm sure that's the safest way to hear of anyone," she replied. He gave a curt nod. "You've been asking questions, I'm told. Only of those who like answering them," she said mildly. "It's a habit of mine." "Well, best leave the rest to us now," he said. "We'll find her one way or another." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Oh, I do hope you will. But one must remember, Inspector, that truth is often shy. It seldom comes when shouted for. Sometimes it requires coaxing." He frowned but said nothing more, turning to bark orders at the constables. Miss Marple slipped quietly into the garden. The flower beds, once carefully tended by Emily Worsley herself, lay flattened by rain and boots. She crouched to examine a patch near the hedge and noticed, half hidden in the mud, a fragment of blue paper. She drew it out gently. The edges were torn, the writing smudged but legible enough to make out a few words. Safe until the ceremony is over. You must not. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Such scraps had meaning. The world, Miss Marple often said, was made of fragments waiting to be aligned. Inside the vicarage, the Reverend was pacing, wringing his hands once again. Mr. Graves sat hunched at the table, his eyes shadowed. He looked up as she entered, as though half expecting an accusation. "They're tearing the grounds apart," he muttered, "as if I buried her under the roses." "Roses do have thorns," Miss Marple said softly. "They hide many things." He gave a humourless laugh. "You think me capable of violence?" "I think," she said, "you are capable of love, which is often the same thing seen from another angle." His head snapped up. "You're mocking me." "Not at all. I've simply observed that people hurt most the things they hold dearest. But there is one thing that puzzles me, Mr. Graves. You said Miss Worsley was devoted to you, and yet she sent a parcel to London. 2 days before the wedding, no less. You didn't mention it when last we spoke." He stiffened. "I didn't know about it." "Ah, then you have learned it since." He hesitated, then said, "Inspector Armitage told me." He spoke to the postmistress. It was only a keepsake for an old friend, perhaps. "Perhaps," Miss Marple echoed. "Though it's curious, isn't it, that she would trouble herself with errands for London while preparing for a wedding she never reached." He made no reply, merely turned away to the window where rain began again, faint and steady. His reflection stared back at him, pale and uncertain. Later, as Miss Marple crossed the lane toward her cottage, she saw young Dr. Pierce bicycling toward her, a satchel slung over his shoulder. He stopped beside her, breathless. "Miss Marple!" "They've found something in the chapel well. Bits of cloth, perhaps part of a dress." She looked up sharply. "White?" "Yes, though it's filthy with mud. The inspector's examining it now." A convenient discovery," she said. "Too convenient, I think. The person who left that locket meant to mislead, and this seems a continuation of the same performance." He frowned. "You think someone's planting evidence?" "I think," she said gently, "that St. Mildred's has a playwright among its flock, though not a very subtle one. When things fit together too neatly, they usually have been arranged by hand." As they reached the chapel, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Price Ridley, of course front and centre, fanning herself with solemn satisfaction. "Mark my words," she declared, "no good ever comes of sudden engagements." "I said so from the beginning," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed you did, Mrs. Price Ridley. You are seldom silent when sense demands it." The inspector shot her a look of irritation as she stepped nearer. "Miss Marple, please, do try not to interfere." "Interfere?" she said innocently. "I was merely admiring the handiwork. Such tidy knots, almost as if whoever tied them wished them to be found." He glanced at her sharply, then back to the recovered fabric. "What do you mean?" "The ribbon," she said, pointing. "It's tied in a bow. Now, most women secure their gowns from the inside, not the outside. This bow was tied after the dress was removed." Armitage scowled. "You're suggesting someone undressed her here?" "Not necessarily. Only that someone wanted us to think she was here." She paused. "Inspector, might I see that note again? The one found on her desk." He hesitated, then handed it over. She studied it briefly, eyes narrowing. "Yes, the same paper as this scrap I found in the garden." She produced the torn fragment from her pocket. "You see how the fibres match? And the ink, same hand, same pen." But this piece, she added, was not written by Miss Worsley. Look at the flourish on the S. Too heavy, too masculine. Someone practised her style, but not well enough. Armitage's eyes widened slightly. Forgery, then, or desperation, Miss Marple said. A false letter to support a false disappearance. The inspector rubbed his chin. So you believe she's alive? I believe she intended to be, she said. But whether she succeeded depends on how far she trusted the person who offered to help her vanish. That evening, Miss Marple returned home and sat quietly with her notebook, jotting small details. Note forged, glove planted, blood type B, not A, parcel to Beryl Sandon. The pattern began to emerge, faint as a watermark beneath the paper. At 9, a knock came at her door. It was Dr. Pierce again, his expression troubled. Miss Marple, I've done a foolish thing. I didn't tell the inspector everything. Yesterday afternoon, before the storm, I saw Mr. Graves walking toward the old rectory stables carrying a bundle. I thought nothing of it at the time. Perhaps decorations for the wedding, but now? Miss Marple folded her hands. The stables, you say? How interesting. Empty these last 3 years since the vicar sold the horses. Tell me, doctor, were his clothes clean when you saw him? He frowned, trying to remember. Yes, dry as could be. It hadn't begun raining yet. Then he returned before the downpour, she said softly, which means if there is anything to be found, the rain won't have spoiled it. Within the hour, lantern in hand, she persuaded the reluctant constable to accompany her to the stables. The night was windless, the air thick with the scent of damp hay. Inside, dust hung like gauze in the beam of the lantern. A rat skittered across the floor, and the constable muttered under his breath. There's nothing here, Miss Marple. Just rubbish, she repeated, stooping. Always worth examining. Her fingers brushed against something stiff beneath a stack of burlap sacks. She pulled gently, revealing a length of coarse cloth, blood-stained and heavy. Beneath it lay a wooden mallet, its handle darkened with dried rust, or something very like it. The constable swore softly. Good Lord! Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but it carried through the still air. Now that, she said, is not a bride's token. That is the sign of a quarrel that ended badly and hurriedly hidden. As they stepped back into the cold night, the lantern's light caught her face. Her expression was calm, though her eyes burned with grim understanding. Somewhere close by, she thought, someone was watching. Someone who had thought themselves safe, but not for long. The constable's lantern flickered against the wind as Miss Marple and he stood before the stable door, the heavy cloth and blood-darkened mallet lying at their feet. The night pressed close around them, thick, cold and expectant, as if the very air of St. Mildred's held its breath. Miss Marple bent again, her eyes moving with deliberate care across the dirt floor. She noted the faint depressions in the hay, the disturbed straw, the slight scuff where something or someone had been dragged. Nothing more, yet her sharp gaze softened with a kind of sad comprehension, as though she already understood what these faint signs meant. "Best we take these inside, miss," Constable Pritchard murmured. "Inspector'll want to see." "Yes," she said, "but let us be discreet. There's a terrible mischief in public curiosity. It spoils everything before the truth has a chance to breathe." They carried the grim evidence to the vicarage, wrapping the mallet carefully in the burlap sack it had hidden beneath. The constable departed to fetch the inspector, leaving Miss Marple momentarily alone in the quiet drawing-room. The clock ticked steadily. In the grate the fire hissed and flared, casting restless shadows against the wall. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the glass of a cabinet, small, unassuming, and calm. Yet behind those mild eyes her mind moved like clockwork. When the door opened again, Inspector Armitage entered briskly, his boots leaving a trail of wet earth. "So," he said, eyeing the bundle, "you've found our missing bride, have you?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, her tone even, "though I fear we've found the shadow of her fate." He knelt, drawing back the cloth, his jaw tightening. "Blood," he muttered. "A great deal of it." "Yes, and not hers, if Dr. Pierce's examination of the chapel stain is to be believed." The inspector frowned. "You're suggesting 2 injuries, or 2 victims?" "Perhaps only one," Miss Marple said softly, "but not the one we think. You see, there are stories that repeat themselves, Inspector. Sometimes a woman disappears to save herself. Sometimes she disappears to protect someone else. Either way, she leaves confusion behind, quite deliberately, in fact. Confusion can be a very effective shield." He straightened, unconvinced. "You think she's alive, then?" "I think," she said carefully, "that she believed she would be when she left. Whether she still is depends upon a gentleman's conscience, and a few hours we cannot account for." Before he could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Lionel Graves stood at the threshold, pale as bone, eyes fixed on the bundle at the inspector's feet. "What's that?" he demanded. "Something found in the stables," said Armitage curtly. "Perhaps you can explain why it was there." The curate's face twitched. "Why, those stables are unused. I've not set foot there in months." Miss Marple's voice was almost tender. "Oh, my dear Mr. Graves, you mustn't burden your soul with falsehoods. You were seen there yesterday carrying a bundle." "Dr. Pierce's eyes are rather sharper than most." Graves flinched, the denial dying on his lips. For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. Then he laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "Very well, I went there, but not for what you think." "Then tell us," said the inspector sharply. He sank into the nearest chair, burying his face in his hands. "It wasn't Emily. It was, God forgive me, it was Sandon." Miss Marple's knitting fingers might have paused a fraction, but her face betrayed nothing. "Mr. Frederick Sandon, the artist." "Yes," his voice cracked. "He came to the vicarage 2 nights before the wedding. He said Emily had written to him, that she meant to leave with him. I told him she wouldn't. I tried to make him see she was mine now, that she loved me. And then?" Armitage pressed. "He laughed at me," Graves whispered. "Called me a fool in a collar. Said she pitied me, nothing more. I lost my temper. I struck him, only once, I swear it. He fell against the table. There was blood, so much of it." He stopped, trembling. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but implacable. "And you hid him in the stables?" "I didn't know what else to do," he said hoarsely. "It was raining. I dragged him there, meant to fetch the doctor, but He swallowed hard. "I was afraid. The wedding, the parish, the shame. I thought if I buried him, no one would know. But when I went back later, he was gone. Gone! The body, the blood, all gone." Armitage stared. "Gone? Are you expecting us to believe that?" "It's the truth," Graves said, his voice breaking. "I searched everywhere, only the mallet remained. I thought perhaps someone found him, took him away." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "You're certain he was dead?" I don't know," he whispered. "He wasn't breathing." "People have been mistaken before," she murmured. "I once knew a maid who fainted so convincingly her mistress ordered mourning ribbons. Imagine her embarrassment when the girl awoke 3 hours later asking for broth." The inspector shot her a look, but she ignored it. "Mr. Graves," she continued softly, "what did you do after that?" "I burned the cloth, cleaned myself up, went to the chapel to pray. That's when Emily found me. She knew at once. She always knew. I told her everything. And what did she do? She said she'd make it right, that she'd help me. She left the house that night to meet him. Said if he was alive, she'd bring him to reason. If he was dead, she'd take the blame." His voice cracked again. "She said no one would believe I'd done such a thing. She said she'd vanish, make it look like she'd run away. Then no one would ask questions." A silence fell that seemed to swallow even the sound of the ticking clock. "So," Miss Marple said at last, "she went out alone into the storm to protect you?" He nodded, tears streaking his face. "And she never came back." Armitage exhaled slowly. "If what you're saying is true, then either she found him alive or she joined him in death." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "Or perhaps she found something else entirely. You said the body was gone. That suggests movement. Someone must have seen or heard. And if Sandon lived, he might have sought revenge or escape." The inspector looked grim. "We'll search the surrounding fields at first light. If Sandon's alive, he'll not get far." Miss Marple rose, her hands steady on the back of her chair. "Inspector, may I suggest you look not outward, but inward? Murder, or near to it, rarely comes from the stranger on the road. It blooms where pride, love, and shame meet. And St. Mildred's soil, I fear, is very fertile indeed." Later that night, long after the house had gone still, Miss Marple stood at her window. The moonlight silvered the village, soft and deceptive. Somewhere beyond the churchyard, a night bird cried. Her mind lingered on Emily Worsley's last known steps, on the chapel's shadowed path, and the damp locket she'd found there. Two faces, one serene, one cunning, side by side. She thought, too, of the missing body and the careful trail of false clues. Such care was rarely the work of panic. It was the mark of calculation. She turned from the window, her thoughts settling with quiet precision. There were still questions to be asked, not of the men but of the women. Of Alice the maid, who knew the chapel too well, and of Mrs. Harper, who had not wept once since the bride's disappearance. "Women," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "always see more than they should, and sometimes they act on it. She drew the curtains and set out her lamp. Tomorrow would bring revelations. She felt it in her bones. But for tonight, she sat beside the window once more, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the slow, pale dawn creep across the sleeping village. The truth, she knew, was almost ready to wake. The next morning broke crisp and bright, as if the heavens themselves wished to wash away the murk of St. Mildred's dark night. But light did little to soften the atmosphere. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though fearing what might be uncovered when shadows gave way to day. Miss Marple, who had slept scarcely an hour, was already awake and dressed, her manner as composed as if she were attending morning service, rather than preparing for a day that might expose the worst kind of human frailty. The bells of St. Mildred's chimed 8 as she left her cottage, the sound rolling through the air in sombre waves. She met Dr. Pierce near the gate, his bicycle propped against the hedge. His expression was grim. "They've found something," he said quietly. Her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Where?" "By the riverbank, half a mile downstream. A man's coat, torn, bloodied. They think it belonged to Sandon." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the handle of her umbrella. "Ah, the river again. It does seem to play a recurring role in our village dramas, doesn't it?" He nodded, though uneasily. "The inspector's there now. He's certain this means Sandon's dead, and that Miss Worsley may have followed him." "Or," she said softly, "that someone wishes us to think so." They walked together in silence toward the bridge. The mist still lingered low over the water, curling like smoke. Inspector Armitage stood on the bank, coat flapping in the breeze, two constables kneeling nearby as they examined the sodden garment spread across a flat rock. "There you are," Armitage said without enthusiasm. More theatrics, I expect you'll say. I might, Miss Marple replied mildly, stepping closer, but only because theatrics so often serve a purpose. The coat was indeed fine. Expensive cloth, well cut, now ruined by mud and river water. Near the breast pocket, the fabric was torn. A jagged hole darkened with what looked like blood. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. Strange, she murmured. The wound's on the left side, but look how shallow it is. A real stab would have pierced through. This looks more like a tear from a nail or hook. The inspector gave a dismissive grunt. The river does curious things to fabric. Yes, she said thoughtfully, but seldom this neat. And you'll note, no sign of weight in the hem. A man wishing to disappear by water would have filled his pockets with stones. So you think he's alive? Armitage said. I think, she answered, that he's clever, and that he knows how to let others believe he is dead. Artists are good at illusions. They spend their lives creating them. Armitage folded his arms. Then where is he now? That, she said, is the question we must ask the right person. Her gaze drifted toward the path leading back to the village, where a figure stood watching them from afar. Alice, the housemaid, her apron twisted in nervous hands. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Poor girl, she said. Guilt often shows first in those least able to bear it. Later that afternoon, she called at the vicarage once more. The Reverend received her with tired courtesy, though his wife hovered behind him, lips pressed tight. Mrs. Harper, Miss Marple said pleasantly, you must forgive an old woman's intrusion. But I've been thinking of Miss Worsley's last evening here. You were kind enough to prepare tea for her, were you not? Mrs. Harper hesitated. Yes, just before she went to the chapel. And she was quite calm? Pale, perhaps, the vicar's wife said quickly, but composed. I thought she was simply tired. Ah, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. And Mr. Graves, was he home then? Mrs. Harper's eyes flickered toward her husband before she answered. He was, in the study. Praying, I believe. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very fortunate to have a household so devoted to prayer. Though I do wonder, was there any sign of the visitor he entertained the previous evening? At this, Mrs. Harper's composure faltered. Visitor? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. The man who came after dark. Mr. Frederick Sandon. The silence that followed was telling. The Reverend's shoulders slumped, and his wife's face drained of colour. Miss Marple continued gently. I do realize it must have been distressing. I imagine Mr. Sandon was not a welcome guest. Mrs. Harper's hands trembled. You know? I know he came. That's quite enough for now. The Reverend spoke at last, voice strained. He did come, late after supper. He said he must speak with Emily. I refused, of course. It was improper, and Lionel was already agitated. But when I went to fetch him, I found the study empty. When I returned, Sandon had gone. I assumed they'd quarrelled. And yet, Miss Marple said, you said nothing of this before. I didn't think it mattered, the Reverend murmured helplessly. Everything matters, Reverend. The smallest omission often tells the largest truth. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I thank you both for your honesty. Oh, one last thing. Mrs. Harper, might I trouble you to tell me where you keep the household keys? The keys? Yes, the chapel door, the vestry, the old stables, all those. They hang in the kitchen, on a hook by the pantry. Miss Marple smiled gently. How orderly! Then you would have noticed, I'm sure, if one had gone missing. Mrs. Harper's eyes widened slightly. Why, yes, the chapel key. I mentioned it to Alice just yesterday. It wasn't there. How very curious, Miss Marple murmured. Thank you, my dear. That evening, as dusk fell, she sent word to the inspector and Dr. Pierce to meet her at the chapel. When they arrived, the old woman was already there, a small lantern glowing at her feet. "You brought us out here for another theory, I suppose," Armitage grumbled. "For a truth," she corrected gently. "And perhaps an ending." She pushed open the chapel door. Inside the air was cold, faintly scented with damp stone and old wax. She led them down the narrow aisle toward the vestry. "You see," she said, "this is the one place where everyone believes something sacred happens, and so no one truly looks. But last night I noticed that the side cupboard here was locked. It shouldn't have been." She took from her pocket a small rusted key. "Alice found this behind the vicarage stove this morning. It belongs to that cupboard." She turned the lock, the hinges groaning as the door opened. Inside, wrapped in a coarse blanket, lay the unmistakable form of a man. Armitage swore softly and knelt. "Dead," he said after a moment. "Been dead for days. The artist, I'll wager." Miss Marple's expression did not change, so Mr. Sandon was not so clever after all. The doctor bent beside him. Blow to the head, heavy, blunt object. Likely the mallet. Poor devil never had a chance. The inspector turned to her. "So the curate's story holds. He struck the man, hid the body, and then panicked." "Not quite," Miss Marple said quietly. "He hid nothing here. The body was moved later by someone who had the chapel key. Someone determined to protect him and mislead the rest of us." Armitage frowned. "You mean Mrs. Harper?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, the maid, Alice. She adored Miss Worsley, spoke of her constantly, and she feared for her. When she saw what Mr. Graves had done, she must have believed Emily was complicit. She moved the body herself, thinking to hide it from the police, and took the key. But she hid it too well. Guilt makes fools of us all. Fools of us all." The inspector looked doubtful. "You have proof?" "Enough," she said. "She will confess when you ask. But the real question, Inspector, is where Miss Worsley is now. Because I do not think she is dead. I think she saw all this, and fled. A woman like that, gentle but resolute, would go far to save a man she believed she loved." The inspector rubbed his temples. "If she's alive, she'll have to come back sometime." "She will," Miss Marple said softly, "when she believes she's safe. And when she does, I fear she will learn that protection once given can be the cruelest form of love." They left the chapel in silence, the wind sighing through the trees. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, gazing back at the quiet building. The lantern light flickered behind her, throwing her shadow long against the path. Somewhere beyond the hills, a train whistle blew, faint, distant, and lonely. She turned toward it, her face unreadable. In that sound, she thought, there might yet be the answer. A ticket purchased in haste, a woman waiting for dawn, and a promise broken before it could be kept. And with that thought, she began the slow walk home, knowing the mystery had not yet ended, but that the truth, like the tide, was beginning to rise. The morning after the discovery in the chapel dawned bleak and heavy, as though the clouds themselves were burdened by the weight of the village's secret. The news spread with the inexorable speed of whispered scandal. By breakfast, everyone from the milkman to the vicar's youngest parishioner knew that a dead man had been found, and by tea, every detail had been embroidered beyond recognition. Some said it was the curate who'd been found. Others claimed the body had no face, and a few, those inclined toward the dramatic, whispered that the corpse had risen when touched. Miss Marple heard none of it directly. She was sitting by her parlour window, knitting with brisk precision, her mind unspooling the threads of truth as deftly as her fingers worked the yarn. She had slept little. When one's conscience was clear, she often said sleep came easily. But when one's thoughts tangled with deceit, even the mind of an old woman could keep sharper watch than any constable. There came a soft knock on her door. Alice stood outside, eyes red and hands twisting her apron until the fabric seemed ready to tear. "Oh, Miss Marple," she blurted, "they're saying dreadful things, that I hid him, that I'm to blame." "Do come in, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, ushering her toward the fire. "And you've done quite right to come. A cup of tea and a few plain words will always do more for the truth than fear and silence." Alice hesitated, glancing about the small room with the wide-eyed wariness of someone expecting judgment. "I didn't mean no harm, miss. Truly I didn't. I only wanted to protect them, to keep the Reverend's house from shame." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Shame can drive people to foolish things. Tell me exactly what you did." The girl wrung her hands. "I saw it that night, the curate, Mr. Graves, carrying something heavy toward the stables. I thought it queer, so I followed him. I didn't see what he buried, but I saw the blood on his sleeve. Later, when the police came, I knew they'd hang him if they found out. So when I went to sweep the chapel and saw the blood there, I thought I could hide it. I cleaned it, miss, as best I could, and I took the key so they wouldn't go looking." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And the body? When did you move it?" Tears welled in Alice's eyes. 2 nights later, miss. I was afraid the dogs might find it. I only wanted to hide it better, that's all. I thought if I put him in the chapel, it'd be safe. No one ever looks in there after dark. And Miss Worsley?" Alice shook her head, bewildered. "I never saw her. I thought she'd run away, like they said. But when I found the locket near the path, I didn't know what to think any more." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea and set it before her. "You've been very brave to tell me this, but one must understand, my dear. Truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. It may take time, but it cannot be kept down forever." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat still for a long while, staring into the fire. The pieces were falling into place, but one corner of the puzzle remained obscured. The locket, the forged note, the parcel to London, all pointed to planning, not panic. And Emily Worsley, from all accounts, had not been a woman easily led. If she had disappeared, it was because she had chosen to. She rose and fetched her shawl. It was time, she decided, to visit the one place in St. Mildred's that no one else thought of as important, the post office. Miss Harker, the postmistress, looked up in surprise as Miss Marple entered, her spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Morning, Miss Marple. You've heard the news, I suppose?" "Such as it is," she replied. "But I've come about a small matter, a parcel sent to London a few days ago. You remember Miss Worsley posted it?" Miss Harker nodded. "I do. Wrapped very neat, tied with green string. She said it was a gift. Strange thing, though. She paid in coin, not stamps. Said she didn't want it traced back. And it was addressed to Miss Beryl Sandon, wasn't it?" "That's right. At a boarding house in Chelsea." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly. "Did she say what was inside?" "Only that it was something that belonged elsewhere, if I remember right." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And you've had no reply, no acknowledgment from London?" "None at all." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out into the pale afternoon light. Something was stirring in her mind, a faint recollection, a whisper of a pattern. She made her way back toward the green, passing the churchyard where Inspector Armitage was speaking with the doctor. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of irritation and weary respect. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, "I hope you've not been questioning more servants." "I find servants often know more of their masters' sins than the masters do themselves," she said pleasantly. "But I've merely been visiting the post office. Such useful places, repositories of gossip, secrets and stamps." Armitage sighed. "You always have your little sayings, don't you? Well, if you've any new wisdom to share, now's the time. The curate's under guard at the rectory. He's confessed enough to hang himself twice over. and I'd rather not see the village lose both its bride and its priest in one season." "I rather think," Miss Marple said gently, "you'll find the curate less guilty than he believes. You see, he struck a man, yes, but I doubt that blow killed him. The wound was shallow. A second wound, deeper, was inflicted later by someone else entirely." The inspector frowned. "And who might that be?" Miss Marple glanced toward the chapel spire, gleaming faintly in the mist. "Someone who had access to the key. Someone who feared exposure more than sin. Reverend Harper, perhaps." He started. "The vicar? Why not? The artist arrives, speaks with Emily, threatens scandal, perhaps blackmail. The Reverend learns of it later. He's a man of propriety. He cannot bear disgrace under his roof. When Lionel's act brings calamity, the Reverend cleanses it as he knows how. He hides it, sanctifies it. He moves the body himself, lays it where prayer and pity might conceal what justice would not." Armitage's face was unreadable. "You're suggesting Harper killed Sandon? I suggest he finished what another began, not from cruelty, but from misguided virtue. A sin committed in service of decency, though no less a sin for that." The inspector stared at her, then muttered, "If you're right, he'll break before nightfall." But Miss Marple shook her head. "No, he won't, not yet. Men like Reverend Harper convince themselves that God understands their reasons. He'll hold out until someone forces him to see that his act, though cloaked in righteousness, was born of pride. Only one person can do that. Who? Miss Worsley." Armitage looked astonished. "You think she's alive?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think she sent that parcel to London not as farewell, but as proof. Whatever was inside, letters perhaps, or the truth itself. She meant it as a safeguard. And I believe she's still in England, likely hiding under her maiden name, somewhere near the line to London. The line to London. Armitage stared, then gave a short laugh. "You'd have made a fine detective, Miss Marple." "Oh, dear me, no," she said with modest surprise. "Detectives look for facts. I merely notice people." That evening the wind rose again, rattling the vicarage windows. Inside, the Reverend knelt before the altar, face drawn and pale. He had dismissed his wife hours earlier, claiming prayer would steady him. But his lips moved soundlessly. The chapel door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, a woman, cloaked and hooded, the hem of her skirt damp with rain. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the Reverend lifted his head. His voice broke the silence like a confession. "Emily." She lowered her hood, pale but alive, eyes bright with sorrow. "You shouldn't have done it," she whispered. "You shouldn't have touched him." "I did what I must," he said hoarsely. "He would have ruined you, ruined Lionel, ruined everything sacred in this parish." "You ruined it instead," she said softly. "You buried mercy to save appearances." He bowed his head. "I prayed it was God's will." Miss Marple, standing quietly in the shadows of the aisle, closed her eyes. She had known Emily would come. Guilt and love had always been her strongest motives. As the wind keened outside and the Reverend wept, Miss Marple turned and slipped away, unseen. There would be time for the law in the morning. Tonight belonged to confession. Outside, the village lay silent once more. The mist had thickened, the lamps glowed dim and golden, and Miss Marple, walking homeward beneath her small umbrella, murmured to herself, "People do the strangest things for love. It is the one sin the world forever forgives, and the one that forever destroys." The following day arrived grey and raw, the sort of morning when the damp seemed to cling to every surface. Yet beneath that pallid calm, the air in St. Mildred's was charged, like the pause before a bell tolls. Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage with deliberate steps, her umbrella tapping softly on the cobblestones. She knew the night's encounter between Reverend Harper and Emily Worsley would not remain secret long. Such things never did in a village so expert in rumour. Still, it was not idle curiosity that moved her. It was the final thread of the tapestry she had been quietly weaving in her mind. At the vicarage gate, she met Inspector Armitage, his face drawn from lack of sleep. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said without preamble. She came back. Mrs. Harper heard voices in the chapel near midnight. Harper and Miss Worsley. By the time we arrived, the girl was gone again. The Reverend hasn't spoken since. "Sits like a statue," Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Shock can do that. But perhaps it is not only shock. Perhaps it is recognition. When a man looks too long upon the thing he has feared to see, the heart sometimes stills before the tongue can move." Armitage frowned. "You speak in riddles, madam. If you've something plain to say, I'd be glad of it." "I dare say you would," she replied gently. "But truth is not plain. It's like lace, full of holes and patterns. You have to hold it to the light." Together they entered the study. Reverend Harper sat in his chair, hands clasped on his knees, eyes fixed on the cold hearth. He did not look up when they entered. The silence was so complete that the small crackle of the fire sounded impertinent. "Reverend," Armitage said briskly, "you spoke with Miss Worsley last night. Where is she now?" No answer. Miss Marple moved closer, her voice low, almost tender. "She came because she wanted you to understand. You did what you thought was righteous, but righteousness without mercy is merely pride in ecclesiastical dress. You can release yourself now. The truth won't damn you half so much as silence." At that, his lips trembled, and a hoarse whisper escaped him. "She forgave me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then tell us how you earned it." He drew a shuddering breath. "I went to the chapel that night. I saw Lionel kneeling, the body beside him. He begged me to help. I thought first of the parish, of scandal, of God's house defiled. I told him to go home. Then I carried what was left of the man to the vestry." He stirred faintly. "I should have called the doctor, but I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought it a mercy to end it quickly. I struck him again." Armitage's jaw tightened. "So it was you?" "Yes, I buried him in prayer and deceit alike. When she came to me, Emily, she said she would bear the blame, that it was her burden as much as ours. I let her go. I told her to vanish, and she did." Miss Marple's face was very still, but her eyes shone with an almost sorrowful clarity. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "that is why the note read, 'I cannot go through with it.' Not the wedding, but the lie." Harper's hands clenched. "She said she would go to London to send proof if ever I should doubt. But she came last night to tell me the world already knew. She said she'd return to face the law if I did not confess. Then she left before dawn." Armitage exhaled sharply. "We'll find her. There's a warrant now for both of them. But if she turns herself in, well, perhaps the court will see compassion in it." Miss Marple's gaze did not leave the Reverend. She will not flee far. Her courage lies too close to duty for that. But I think there is more yet hidden. Tell me, Reverend, the parcel she sent to London, did she say what it contained?" He looked up slowly, eyes rimmed with red. "Letters. His letters. Proof that he sought to blackmail her. She said she could not burn them, only send them away until all was finished. 'That will do,' she said. 'The parcel will tell us what words cannot.'" By evening, the small train from London brought a constable bearing a brown-wrapped package. The green string was faded, the label blurred, but the name was clear. Miss Jane Marple, St. Mildred's. Armitage blinked. "You?" It was sent to you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Dear Emily was rather more clever than she let on. She once asked me how one might ensure the truth found safe hands. I told her, why, send it to someone too dull to be suspected." She unwrapped the parcel carefully. Inside lay a sheaf of letters in a man's florid handwriting. Sandon's. The tone was first ardent, then bitter, then unmistakably threatening. One line stood out. "If you will not marry me, your curate shall learn what became of your father's money, and how I helped you keep it." Armitage swore softly. So it was blackmail after all. Miss Marple nodded. "Her father died under a small cloud of financial confusion, you recall. Sandon must have known something, perhaps fabricated it. She paid him in attention, then in fear. When Lionel proposed, Sandon saw profit in jealousy. He came to confront her before the wedding. Lionel's blow silenced him for a time, but the Reverend's conscience did the rest." The inspector folded the letters back into their wrapper. "Enough to close the case. The curate will stand trial for assault, the Reverend for manslaughter. And Miss Worsley," he hesitated, "she'll have to testify if we find her." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window. The last light of day bled crimson across the horizon. "You needn't search far," she said. "She's waiting." Indeed, as they stepped outside, they saw her. A solitary figure standing by the lich gate, hands clasped before her, her face pale but composed. The wind tugged at her veil like a ghost of bridal lace. Armitage approached cautiously. "Miss Worsley, you understand what this means?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I've come to tell the truth. They meant to protect me, both of them, and I let them. That's the worst sin of all." Miss Marple moved forward, touching her arm. "The worst sin, my dear, is to lose faith in forgiveness. Go now and speak plainly. It is the only way to free them." Emily met her eyes and nodded. There was a calmness about her then, a strength born not of defiance, but of acceptance. She walked with the inspector toward the vicarage, her steps sure, her head high. Miss Marple remained by the gate, watching until they disappeared inside. The evening bells began to ring, slow and solemn, and she thought how often they had tolled for weddings, christenings and funerals alike, marking joy, life, and loss with the same patient sound. The next morning, the village woke to a strange quiet. The scandal, though immense, seemed already to soften at the edges. The curate had confessed. The Reverend had resigned himself to mercy. Miss Worsley would stand witness, not as a fugitive, but as a woman reclaimed by honesty. Mrs. Price Ridley, of course, declared it all a dreadful reflection on modern morals, while Mrs. Bantry found it quite thrilling. But Miss Marple merely smiled when they pressed her for details. "Oh, it was very simple," she said. "A case of too much virtue and too little truth. The two seldom live comfortably together. That night, as she sat by her hearth, she took up her knitting again. The pattern was one of her own invention, a lattice of fine lines, intricate yet orderly. She worked in silence, her thoughts as steady as the rhythmic click of her needles. Human nature, she reflected, was rather like her work, a tangle of bright threads and dark, forever twisting together, forever seeking order, and yet always leaving a stray loop somewhere near the heart. Outside, the wind had dropped. The village slept under a calm sky, and Miss Marple, content in her quiet certainty, smiled to herself as the clock chimed midnight. The case of the curate's missing bride had ended, as all such stories did, not with triumph, but with understanding. And for Miss Marple, that was the truest form of justice there was. The trial at County Hall took place a month later, though in St. Mildred's people spoke of it as if it had happened in their own sitting rooms. The weather had turned cold again. Frost glistened on the hedgerows, and the village's breath rose like smoke each morning. Miss Marple travelled by the early train, a modest figure in grey, her expression mild, but her eyes alive with thought. She went not for spectacle, but because, as she told Mrs. Bantry, one must see justice carried out, if only to remind oneself that it seldom looks quite as tidy as we hope. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the murmurs of onlookers. Lionel Graves sat pale and drawn, his once earnest eyes shadowed by remorse. Reverend Harper, gaunt and solemn, sat a few benches behind him, hands clasped as if still in prayer. Emily Worsley was there too, composed yet frail, her veil lifted just enough for the light to touch her face. When she took the stand, the hush was immediate. Her voice trembled only once. "It was never Lionel's fault," she said. "He struck Mr. Sandon, yes, but he didn't kill him. Mr. Sandon was alive when the Reverend found him. He told me so before I left. He said he had done what he thought was merciful. He meant to protect us all." There were gasps, then silence. The magistrate, grave and deliberate, leaned forward. "And you left St. Mildred's that night to conceal the truth?" "I left," Emily said softly, "because I could not bear to see good men destroyed by my mistakes." The proceedings moved with slow inevitability. The evidence was plain. Lionel had struck in passion. Reverend Harper had dealt the fatal blow, and both had concealed the act. Yet their motives, love, duty, fear, wove a net of pity that even the law could not wholly untangle. When sentence was passed, it was lenient, the curate's charge reduced to assault, the Reverend found guilty of manslaughter, his punishment softened by age and conscience. Emily Worsley was free, though forever marked by what had happened. When it was over, Miss Marple lingered in the emptying hall, watching the three of them speak briefly under the watchful eye of the guards. There was forgiveness in their faces, though none of it seemed to lighten them. She sighed quietly. "It is never quite finished," she murmured. "The law may close its book, but hearts rarely do." Outside, the afternoon light slanted low across the cobblestones. The inspector joined her on the steps, tugging his hat low against the wind. "You were right from the beginning," Armitage said gruffly. "If I'd listened earlier, we might have spared the worst of it." "Perhaps," she replied gently. "But people seldom listen to what they are not ready to hear. That's why truth must sometimes wait for the proper hour." He smiled faintly. "Still, I'd have you on my staff any day, Miss Marple." She gave a soft laugh. "Goodness, no. I'd never do. I'd have the whole department at tea before the week's end, and that would ruin any sense of order." The inspector chuckled, tipped his hat, and walked away. She watched him go, her thoughts turning not to triumph, but to the fragile threads that had led to this moment. The locket glinting in the grass, the maid's trembling confession, the rain-washed glove by the river-bank. Each had been small, almost trivial, yet together they had uncovered the heart of a tragedy. When Miss Marple returned to St. Mildred's, the village was already smoothing over the scandal with the practised grace of English small-town decency. The vicarage shutters remained closed. Mrs. Harper had gone to stay with her sister in Bath. The chapel, newly scrubbed, smelled faintly of soap and damp stone. The villagers resumed their routines with relief, as if the whole affair were a bad dream, best folded away. But Miss Marple knew better. Evil, or rather human weakness, was not a storm that passed. It was the weather of life itself, recurring in new forms whenever vigilance grew dull. Still, she found comfort in small things. The sound of the kettle beginning to whistle, the chatter of the milkman's boy, the postmistress humming behind her counter. These, she thought, were the steady notes that made the darker ones bearable. A week after the trial, a letter arrived from Emily Worsley. The handwriting was delicate but steady. "My dear Miss Marple, I can never thank you enough for your kindness. You saw what none of us could. That pity can be as blinding as guilt. I'm leaving England for a time. A cousin has offered me a place in Florence, where no one knows my name. Perhaps there I shall learn to live again without fear of looking behind me. I have left the locket in your care. It no longer belongs to me, but to the past." With deepest gratitude, Emily Miss Marple read the letter twice, then opened the small parcel that had come with it. Inside lay the silver locket, its surface newly polished, both portraits removed. She turned it over in her palm, feeling its weight. "A poor child," she whispered. "She's cut out the faces, but not the memory." Later that afternoon, she walked to the churchyard. The sky was pale and clean, the air scented faintly of frost and wood smoke. She paused before the chapel door, now fitted with a new lock, and looked up at the stone cross above it. The last of the autumn leaves drifted down, settling soundlessly on the path. She laid the locket beneath the yew tree, where the first snowdrops were beginning to push through the soil. As she stood there, footsteps approached. Dr. Pierce came up the path, his coat buttoned tight. "You always seem to arrive just before me," he said with a rueful smile. "I find that the early hour tells one more truth than the late one," she replied. He looked down at the flowers. "The village owes you more than it knows. You uncovered the rot before it spread." Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, no, I merely brushed aside the leaves. The rot had already done its work. But nature has a way of renewing things, Doctor. Even broken hearts can grow tender again, given time." They stood in silence, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys below. Then Dr. Pierce said softly, "And what of the curate? Do you think he'll ever return?" She smiled faintly. "To St. Mildred's? No, he'll find another parish, perhaps a poorer one. Work can be a great balm to sorrow, provided one learns not to mistake it for penance." "And the Reverend? Praying, I imagine. That too can be a refuge when the world becomes too sharp." They parted at the gate. Miss Marple took the long way home, following the footpath through the meadows, where frost glittered like powdered glass. As she walked, she thought of Emily's words, "Learn to live again without fear." It was what they all desired in their own way, though few found it easily. Perhaps that was why people lied, why they concealed and struck out and forgave. They were all searching for peace, and sometimes mistook silence for it. When she reached her cottage, the kettle was singing cheerfully, and her canary gave a single approving chirp. She settled into her chair by the fire, setting aside her shawl. The flames danced merrily, throwing gold on the walls, and the familiar creak of the floorboards seemed to sigh with contentment. She took up her knitting again, something pale blue this time, soft and fine. As the pattern grew, her thoughts drifted back over the weeks. She saw it all again. The missing bride, the whispering villagers, the storm, the chapel in the rain. It was all so ordinary, she thought, and yet within that ordinariness lay the entire map of human frailty. People killed not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear of losing love, fear of shame, fear of themselves. Her needles clicked steadily. "It always comes down to that," she murmured. "Fear, and what kindness can undo it?" Outside, the church bell began to chime the hour, slow and familiar. Each note carried softly across the green, mingling with the rustle of wind through bare branches. Miss Marple listened, smiling a little. Somewhere far away, perhaps in Florence, Emily Worsley might be hearing another bell at that very moment, beginning her new life. The thought comforted her. When the last chime faded, she set down her knitting and leaned back, eyes half closed. The fire crackled, the canary rustled its feathers, and peace settled gently over the room. It was not a triumphant peace, nor a loud one, but the quiet kind that comes after understanding. A peace that asked for nothing and gave, in its simplicity, everything. In the stillness, Miss Marple spoke softly to the empty room. "You see," she said, as if explaining to some invisible listener, "it is never the crime itself that matters most. It's the reason people believe they must commit it. Once you know that, there's little mystery left, only a story as old as human nature played again and again beneath a different roof, a different roof, a different—" She reached for her teacup, took a sip, and smiled. And that, I think, is quite enough excitement for one winter. The clock ticked on, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, night began to fall over St. Mildred's, gentle and forgiving. In the little cottage by the green, Miss Marple's lamp glowed warmly against the dark, a small beacon of patience and quiet understanding in a world forever turning with its mix of sin and grace. Spring came early to St. Mildred's that year, as if the land itself wished to breathe again after months of quiet unease. The snowdrops Miss Marple had seen budding beneath the yew now dotted the churchyard like white tears, and the sound of children's laughter once more echoed across the green. Yet, though the air was lighter, the memory of what had passed lingered faintly, like perfume after the wearer has gone. People spoke less of the affair now, though their glances sometimes strayed toward the vicarage when the subject of forgiveness arose. Life, as Miss Marple well knew, was expert at papering over tragedy without ever truly forgetting it. It was on one of these mild afternoons that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Leonard Pierce arrived on his bicycle, his coat dusty from the road and his expression curiously intent. He had always been polite, even deferential toward Miss Marple, but today there was an edge of purpose about him that made her raise an eyebrow as he removed his hat. "My dear doctor," she said, motioning him inside, "you look as though you've been chasing something." "In a way, I have," he replied, following her into the sitting room. "Something or someone. I thought it best to tell you before I go to the police." She poured tea with her usual calm precision. "Now that sounds most alarming. Do sit down and explain yourself before you upset the pot entirely." He smiled faintly despite himself and took the chair opposite her. "It's about the trial," he began. "Or rather, about what came after. I've had correspondence from London, a colleague at St. Thomas's Hospital. He mentioned a curious case that came in last week. A woman found unconscious near Waterloo Station. No papers, no money, but she gave a name before collapsing. Emily Graves." Miss Marple's hand stilled mid-pour, though her expression remained gentle. "Graves? Yes, not Worsley, Graves. She claimed to be the curate's wife." He watched her face carefully, but Miss Marple only set the teapot down with a soft clink. "And what do you think of that, doctor?" "I don't know what to think. The report said she'd suffered a fever and exhaustion, perhaps overwork. She's lucid now, but she refuses to see anyone except someone she calls the lady who knows." I thought she must mean you." Miss Marple folded her hands, her gaze thoughtful. "How very odd, and yet not wholly unexpected. There was always a quiet determination about that girl, a need to make things right, even when rightness had already cost her dearly." "Will you come, then?" he asked. "I shall," she said simply. One must always answer when conscience calls, even if it comes in another's voice. They took the morning train the next day, the countryside unspooled beyond the windows in soft greens and browns, fields blurring into towns, towns into the grey sprawl of London. Miss Marple sat knitting, her needles clicking softly, while Dr. Pierce watched her with the faintly astonished respect of a man who could not quite understand how calm could coexist with curiosity so sharp. At St. Thomas's, the matron led them through long corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender. Emily lay in a small room at the end, her face pale but peaceful. When she saw Miss Marple, a faint smile touched her lips. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. "My dear," Miss Marple said, taking her hand, "you've given everyone quite a fright. What is all this nonsense about being Mrs. Graves?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Because I am. We were married quietly after the trial. Lionel said he couldn't begin again without making things right. We thought we could go abroad, start afresh, but he never came. The letter he sent said he had to finish one last duty before he could join me. That was months ago." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "One last duty," she repeated. "Did he say what it was?" "No, only that it concerned Mr. Sandon's family. He wanted to make amends, return something that was never his." The doctor leaned forward. "Perhaps money?" Emily shook her head weakly. "A painting, the one Frederick painted of me before we quarrelled. He said he couldn't rest until it was back where it belonged. He thought it would bring peace." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the young woman's hand. "And did he ever reach them, Sandon's people?" "I don't know. I waited in Florence as we planned, but no word came. When I came back to England to look for him, I fell ill on the journey. That's all I remember." Miss Marple sat in silence for a long moment, her eyes far away. "A painting," she murmured. "Yes, that would explain a good deal." She turned to Dr. Pierce. "I think we had better call on the late Mr. Sandon's London lodgings. There are often more truths in a studio than in a courtroom." The address, as Emily recalled it, was in Chelsea, in one of those narrow streets where ivy climbed stubbornly up soot-darkened walls. They found the building easily enough. An old house now let to several tenants, the top floor still bearing the faint trace of Sandon's name on the door. Inside, the room smelled of dust and turpentine. Canvases leaned against the walls, some unfinished, others crudely slashed. But in the corner, beneath a threadbare cloth, stood one that caught Miss Marple's eye. She drew the cover aside. It was a portrait, a woman's face, luminous even under the grime of neglect. Emily's face, yet not the sweet, tranquil expression Miss Marple remembered. This Emily was alive, defiant, her eyes bright with challenge and sorrow. The brushstrokes were bold, the background dark, and in the bottom corner, almost obscured by shadow, was another hand, Sandon's, faintly painted, reaching toward her shoulder. Dr. Pierce exhaled softly. "Remarkable likeness. Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "But look here." She pointed to the edge of the frame, where a small section had been pried loose. Inside, folded tightly between the canvas and the wood, was a piece of paper, yellowed with age. She eased it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was Sandon's, unmistakable from the letters she had seen. "If you are reading this, then I have paid my price. There was never blackmail, only love turned bitter. Emily feared her past, but I would have freed her. Tell her I forgive her, and the man who struck me. It was not his hand that ended me, but my own pride." Dr. Pierce stared at the note in silence. So the Reverend's blow didn't kill him at once. He must have written this afterward, knowing he was dying. Miss Marple nodded, and Lionel went to return the painting because he suspected the same. He wished to lay the ghost properly to rest. She turned the frame over again, frowning. But if he came here, where is he now? They searched the room, but there was no sign of recent habitation, only dust and silence. Then Dr. Pierce noticed a folded scrap wedged beneath the doorframe. He bent to pick it up. "Another letter," he said, handing it to her. It was brief, written in Lionel's firm hand. "I have found what I sought. When she receives this painting, tell her she is free. I go where I should have gone long ago, to confess the truth that was never spoken." Miss Marple's eyes closed for a moment. "Poor boy," she said softly. "He's gone to the Reverend, to share the weight, as good men always try to do." And indeed they found him the next day, in a quiet parish not far from Canterbury, where Harper had been sent after his release. The two men had been living under the same roof, working among the poor. When they arrived, the local curate told them both had gone walking early that morning along the cliffs. The wind was sharp when they reached the edge. Two figures stood near the sea side by side, one tall, one stooped. As they approached, Lionel turned, the wind whipping his hair across his face. "It's done," he said simply. "We've written to the coroner, enclosed the painter's confession. The truth will out at last. No more lies. No more lies." The Reverend laid a trembling hand on his shoulder. "We have made peace with God, Miss Marple. Now we must make peace with ourselves." She looked at them both for a long moment. There was sorrow there, yes, but also serenity, and she knew, as surely as she knew the shape of her own thoughts, that nothing more needed to be said. When she and the doctor turned back toward the village, the wind carried their voices faintly. A prayer, perhaps, or only the sea echoing its endless hymn of forgiveness. Miss Marple walked in silence, her small frame steady against the gusts. She knew that this was the true ending, not the one written by judges or whispered by neighbours, but the quiet closing of a circle. By the time she reached her cottage again, the first evening swallows had begun to dart above the rooftops. She lit her lamp and sat by the window, her knitting basket at her feet, watching the light fade over the green. For a moment she thought of Emily, safe, perhaps, in Florence again, and of the two men whose repentance had come too late to spare them sorrow, yet just in time to save their souls. Then she smiled faintly to herself, threading a new strand of wool through her needles. "Yes," she murmured, "forgiveness does have the oddest ways of finding people. It seldom arrives when they expect it, but it never loses its way." Outside, the wind softened, and the last light of day lingered on the horizon, warm and gold as the end of a prayer. The following spring, St. Mildred's bloomed as though the village itself were exhaling at last. Tulips lined the stone paths to the church. Swallows stitched the air with their bright arcs. The chapel door, newly painted white, stood open again, and the bell rang clear over fields that had forgotten the sound of scandal. Yet Miss Marple, sitting in her garden with her knitting, knew that peace was never a simple thing. It came, like forgiveness, in layers. First quiet, then understanding, and only after a long time, forgetfulness. A letter arrived one soft April morning, forwarded through the parish office. It bore the neat hand of the Bishop of Canterbury, and a single sheet of pale paper inside. "Dear Miss Marple, you will wish to know that Mr. Graves and Reverend Harper have completed their service at the coastal parish. Both men have now taken vows of seclusion, one to the mission in Cornwall, the other to a hospital chapel in Kent. Their work among the poor has been exemplary. They ask no forgiveness but are determined to live as if it had been granted. Yours sincerely, Bishop T. Langley." Miss Marple folded the letter with slow precision. "As if it had been granted," she murmured. "Well, That is the beginning of grace, after all. Later that week, the postmistress brought another envelope. This one postmarked from Florence. Inside was a small photograph. Emily Worsley, no, Mrs. Graves, standing in a sunlit courtyard, a sketchbook in hand, her face lifted toward the light. On the back was written in delicate script, "There is such peace in painting again." I think he would have liked that. Beneath it, in a different ink, a final line. "You were right. Forgiveness travels farther than guilt ever can." Miss Marple smiled, not sentimentally, but with quiet satisfaction. Human hearts, she thought, were like her garden. Seeds of sorrow often bloomed into something unexpectedly gentle, if left long enough to the weather and the will of God. The following Sunday she attended service at St. Mildred's. The pews were nearly full. Even Mrs. Price Ridley had regained her composure, though she now spoke in whispers about nothing more dangerous than marmalade recipes. When the organ began its slow prelude, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the new curate. Earnest, shy, and much too young to imagine evil existing in the world, she hoped he would keep his innocence a little while longer. After the service, she lingered by the churchyard gate. Dr. Pierce joined her, his hat in hand. "You've tied up another mystery neatly, Miss Marple," he said with a half-smile. She shook her head. "Oh, dear me, no. Life never ties things up neatly, Doctor. It only folds them away for later. The truth, when it comes, is seldom about the crime at all. It's about what people feared might be discovered." He laughed softly. "And yet you always seem to find it." "Because people, my dear, are endlessly consistent," she said. "They tell you who they are by what they hide." They walked a short way together, the afternoon light glinting on the church's stained glass. The village green was bright with children, and somewhere a kettle whistled, a small, homely sound that felt like a benediction. When Miss Marple reached her cottage, she placed the bishop's letter and Emily's photograph in her writing desk beside the folded newspaper clipping of the trial. She hesitated only a moment before locking the drawer. Some stories, she thought, were not meant for retelling. They lived better in silence, like prayers answered in secret. Outside, the sun dipped behind the thatched roofs, gilding them briefly before surrendering to twilight. She settled once more in her chair, her knitting needles flashing in the fading light. The pattern she worked was simple, a chain of interlocking loops. But as she added each row, she smiled to herself, seeing in it the same design that ran through all her cases. Small mistakes, tangled intentions, and somewhere beneath it all, the patient rhythm of redemption. When the clock struck 6, she looked up at the mantel. "Well," she said aloud, "that is that. Poor Emily, poor Lionel, poor Reverend. They've each found their place, and St. Mildred's may sleep again." Her canary chirped from its cage, and the old woman nodded, satisfied. The world outside her window was growing dim, but inside the lamplight burned steadily, casting its calm glow over the neat little room. In the end, Miss Marple thought it had not been malice that darkened St. Mildred's, but love misunderstood, love that sought to protect, to possess, to purify. Such love could destroy as easily as it could save, yet given time and truth, even that could be mended. She sipped her tea, set down her cup, and listened as the church bell began its evening chime. Each note rolled softly through the village, fading into the quiet hills beyond. And Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful and serene, whispered as though to the sound itself, "Yes, peace at last, peace at last."